It's no secret that while the current legacy horror trend has been exciting for some people, it's left me and a lot of other fans feeling somewhat underwhelmed. Some may argue that these movies have done well financially and are popular with the majority, and that is enough for those people to justify these movies' existence. But not only is that type of groupthink reaction ridiculous to me, and completely dismissive of a lot of other people's very valid opinions, to me it also shifts the focus away from what the actual problem is with these movies. Of course they're going to make money. They have a recognizable name, and that seems to be the only thing that audiences want these days, is something that is familiar to them. Truthfully, modern legacy horror feels like it's turning into the MCU, cashing in on established IPs without offering much creatively to make them stand out. The result has been a series of cash grabs that, in my opinion, have damaged the legacy of these once iconic franchises. Let's discuss.
I watch so you don't have to.
All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
In order for you to understand why I believe this is the worst era for legacy horror that we've ever had, we have to go back to 2018 and seemingly where this whole trend began. Halloween 2018 was billed as a proper sequel to the 1978 original that would, quote, ignore the inferior sequels of the 80s and 90s.
Oh man, I got peanut butter on my penis.
The whole idea behind this, I thought, was to restore the franchise to the quality of that original film. Now it's debatable if this film actually managed to do that, although I would argue that Halloween 2 from 1981 is actually a superior sequel when compared to the 2018 requel version. Even worse yet, Halloween 2018 led us directly into its own batch of inferior sequels, that being Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends.
That is one big pile of shit.
Two very controversial and divisive films that seemingly split the fan base right down the center. Something that modern Hollywood has become very good at and known for, unfortunately. Gone are the days of an occasional movie being universally loved by everyone. The biggest problem with this new Halloween series, specifically with Kills and Ends, was that these films felt like Halloween in name only.
Purely and simply evil.
Which is an all too common theme with these modern legacy horror movies. This new timeline was supposed to restore quality and offer a fresh perspective on this story. What we got instead was retreads and old ideas passed off as the filmmaker's own. The end result to me was the most forgettable Halloween movies to date. And yes, I'm including Halloween Resurrection in that discussion, which is god-awful by the way. But at least it kind of knows that it's god-awful.
Trick or treat.
To me, Kills and Ends are trying to pass themselves off as being superior to the sequels that they replaced. And in reality, to me, they are just as bad, if not worse, creatively. Regardless of all of that, the financial success of these movies kickstarted this whole legacy sequel trend, where classic horror franchises are being reintroduced to modern audiences, in hopes of creating something just as iconic as the movies that started it all. But in my opinion, we really haven't seen such a movie spawned from this trend.
We ain't found shit.
Candyman 2021 managed to undermine Tony Todd's significance to the franchise, and gave the impression that Candyman is more of an idea and could be anyone. Scream 5 used legacy characters as glorified cameos, and tried to replace those characters with less interesting characters. All while taking the opportunity to attack fans in its message, who might have valid criticisms about movies that Hollywood makes and voices them regularly. Hellraiser 2022 felt like a poor attempt to reinvent the wheel, all while stripping away the artistic integrity and the beautiful brutality that set the original apart from all of the other horror movies that came out around that time. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022 on Netflix was absolute cringe and a complete abomination, and in no way reminiscent of the gritty and revolutionary original that it claimed it was trying to follow up. And then we have Evil Dead Rise, which for me at least, after the trailer was released, I felt it had the most promise of any of the legacy sequels. But it became very clear as I was watching it that that movie was going to be exactly what it was always going to be. A modern reimagining of Evil Dead and not a proper sequel or continuation that I was hoping for. Evil Dead Rise managed to take one of the most unique horror franchises and make it feel like every other demon possession movie you've seen in the past 10 years.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Completely devoid of the charm that made the originals work. In fact, it feels more like an inferior sequel to the 2013 remake than it does anything. To me, it is the very definition of a movie truly not knowing what it wants to be. Which brings me to my overall point and a thought that crossed my mind recently that inspired this entire video. I thought to myself, is this the worst era for these movies creatively? Since most of them don't seem to be keeping with the spirit of the originals like they originally intended to do.
But why?
It's what I thought the whole point of this trend was to begin with. So I thought back to another time in cinema where people made claims that the horror genre was in a very bad way. Most notably in the early 2000s when the genre went through a remake boom. And I even found a current article that talked about how this was a low point for horror in general. Now I realize that there is a stigma around the word remake at this point, with most people being very dismissive of remakes, especially remakes of beloved movies.
No, don't like that.
Simply because a lot of fans feel like they're unnecessary, and I understand that argument. I mean, why try to improve upon perfection, right? However, if you look at the remakes that came out during that time, I feel like many of them didn't try to recreate those original films. They didn't try to be them. And filmmakers instead were legitimately trying to put their own spin on these iconic films. Now, they didn't all work, and I'm looking at you, A Nightmare on Elm Street remake.
What the hell am I looking at? When does this happen in the movie?
But to me, many of them were altered enough and given enough creative freedom to justify their existence. To me, Dawn of the Dead 2004, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003, The Hills Have Eyes 2006, Friday the 13th 2009, and yes, the Evil Dead remake from 2013 were all remakes that deviated from the originals tonally, but still managed to carve their own spots out in cinematic history. In the 2000s, their way of modernizing these stories wasn't to add heavy-handed social commentary,
Message!
or to undermine the original stories and characters in favor of new characters. They modernized them by turning up the intensity to 11 and creating a more fast-paced and brutal version of these characters and stories than we've seen before. And with the movies I just mentioned, I feel like that worked. And I feel like because of that, over time, more people have become accepting of those remakes.
Well, that wasn't such a chore now, was it?
Because believe it or not, they were less divisive than what we are getting now. And again, they really didn't undermine what came before. Fans could even ignore these movies if they chose to, which is another benefit that they offer. With the legacy sequels and requels, that's the studios and filmmakers trying to force what is canon on fandom new and old. And I never thought that was going to have the desired effect that they were hoping for. You're basically telling people to ignore movies that they might love in favor of more divisive modern films, and that is a slippery slope to operate on.
Some motherfucker always trying to ice skate uphill.
For me personally, I much prefer the early 2000s remake trend than I do the legacy sequel trend. In the end, I don't feel like the remakes ruined the legacy of the franchises like people thought they would back when they were released. In fact, I feel like they prolonged those franchises so the legacy sequel trend could happen. To me, the early 2000s remakes did a much better job of reintroducing these stories to modern audiences, with a version of the product that appealed to those audiences specifically. The legacy sequels, on the other hand, have done nothing to improve upon these franchises' standing in pop culture, because they too often either play it safe or deviate too far from what makes the originals popular, while somehow still trying to be just like them. And that's why I believe the current era of legacy horror is the worst we've had creatively in cinema history.
Y'all be cool. Right on.